go ahead and welcome you to Bexley Public Library virtual program. I'm Ben Heckman, Library Director. If it sounds a little strange, I'm coming to you from my birthday dinner, and I couldn't think of any better way to start my birthday evening festivities off with introducing some great people here for this great program. We're glad to have you here on this Monday evening in April to hear and learn from author and conversationist Dr. Meg Lowman. Canopy Meg, as she is sometimes referred to, will discuss her book, The Arbornaut, The Life Discovering the Eighth Continent and the Trees Above Us. She'll be in conversation with Troy Markham and Mayor Ben Kessler, two of our local celebrities, who I'll introduce in just a moment. But first, I want to say a special thanks to Paige and Michael Crane and their fund at the Bexley Public Library for funding tonight's event. Thank you to the Bexley Arbor Day Celebration Committee for partnering with us to present this. We're grateful for the work of the committee and the work that they do to celebrate Bexley's status as the first municipal arboretum and acknowledge the value that our incredible canopy of trees brings to our community. Bexley Public Library is truly honored to work with our partners like these to strengthen our efforts to bring you and our community informative programming that is engaging and inspiring. And I know tonight's program will be just that. Now, in addition to tonight's program, we hope you'll continue to celebrate Arbor Month with us by joining us April 19th for Tree Trivia Tuesday at the Drexel, when we'll be giving out shrubs as prizes to the winners, thanks to the Bexley Community Foundation. And then on Sunday, April 24th, for a special Pro Musica Columbus performance for the kiddos in South Community Gardens at the Ferry Garden Community Center, and again at the South Community Gardens on Saturday, April 30th for a family-friendly celebration of Arbor Day featuring crafts and activities for kids. There are many, many more Arbor Day celebrations throughout our community this month, and I encourage you to learn all about it at bexley.org/Arbor Day. And with that, I'd like to introduce Troy Markham, who will be in conversation with Dr. Lowman this evening. He is a resident of 20 plus years of Bexley. He is currently the City Council President. He's a Master of Science in Plant Pathology from OSU. He's a science instructor at OSU and Capital University. He's authored several science textbooks, including instructional materials, as well as his own Bexley memoir, Exile in Louisville. I'm happy to have such a well-read scientist, scholar, politician, and all-around good guy to speak with Dr. Meg Lowman tonight. Thank you, Troy.
Thank you, Director Heckman, and happy birthday to you tonight. I'm excited to be here with you, and I'm super excited to have our guest here tonight, Dr. Meg Lowman. I've been reading her book all week, and it's been kind of a rainy week here in Ohio, but it is a delight. I've got it right here. Fantastic. And I can't wait to hear from her and talk to her. And really, I'm excited that here in Bexley, Ohio, that we're going to have someone like her here to talk to us. I'm just really, really excited. I'm going to read your bio off the book here. So forgive me for doing a little reading. But Meg Lowman Ph.D., Canopy Meg, is an American biologist, educator, ecologist, writer, editor, and public speaker. She is the executive director of the Tree Foundation and a professor at the National University of Singapore, Arizona State University, and the University of Sains Malaysia. Nicknamed, she's got some really great nicknames. Nobody's ever given me a nickname, but if they did, I would love for something like these. The Real Life Lorax by National Geographic magazine. And I love this one too, Einstein of the Treetops. I hope you have that engraved somewhere, or at least on a t-shirt or something, because that's fantastic. And that was bestowed by the Wall Street Journal. Meg Lowman pioneered the science of canopy ecology, which is just, the book is so exciting, and she's going to tell us about being in the treetops. And her motto is "No child left indoors," which I think is a fantastic message as well. She travels extensively for research, outreach, and speaking engagements, and she's here with us tonight. Again, here's the book, The Arbornaut, and I'm going to turn it over to you now, but the book is just fantastic. I hope everybody grabs it. It is a love story to trees and more. It's an important message about ecology and also science. I think science in general, and especially for female scientists, and how important that change has become, and hopefully is continuing in our society as well. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Lowman. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. We're so excited to get you here. And I think you said you're coming from Sarasota, Florida tonight.
I am. Oh, thanks, Troy. What a pleasure. And how lovely to have the mayor present and the head of your library and all sorts of good things. So I look forward to some conversation. But first, I think you asked me to maybe share a few pictures and stories that come from the book. So I'm really delighted to do that as an introduction. And like a lot of you, maybe I came from a small town, and everybody hopefully has a few trees in his or her town that might inspire kids to become arbornauts like me. So I'm going to try to share this screen, and Troy, maybe you can confirm to me if I get the picture up okay. And can you see that?
We are, yeah, there it is. That looks great.
Okay, thanks for checking. And if you lose it or something happens, just give a shout out, because I would hate for people to miss the program because of my technology or something. But I will share a few little pieces from the book. I did write this book in part because I was a woman in science at a time when most women definitely did not climb trees and did not usually aspire to be in any leadership positions. So I didn't really have many living role models. I never even had a woman professor, which is amazing. So I thought maybe if I write a book about my misadventures, as I call them, then girls could be better prepared for careers in almost any field, not just science itself. But I will be totally transparent. I'm the mother of 2 boys, so I think it helps boys to learn about the challenges of careers and life in general, and hopefully they can benefit from a book like this as well. So as a kid, I was a real nature nut, and maybe that's why I had that motto about no child left indoors. I collected wildflowers and pressed them in telephone books back in the day when telephone books were made of paper and not some little piece of app in your iPhone. And I collected everything, snake skins and shells and rocks and little tree bark samples, and put them in shoeboxes under my bed. My mother wasn't too excited about that. But I think for a lot of field biologists, we now realize that collecting things as a kid might have been a common thread to inspire us about studying nature and maybe becoming a scientist someday. So this really embarrassing photo was me in 5th grade taking my wildflower collection to the New York State Science Fair, and literally one of the only girls in a big auditorium with about 500 kids, and shy as I could be. But in the end, I got a 2nd prize, which was unbelievable, a little plastic trophy, and I was quite amazed. But maybe that helped me think that I could someday do something with my wildflowers in my collection. So I guess it was a really good experience in the end. And I think for a lot of kids, thinking about nature, using your 5 senses, going outdoors, and these days taking pictures or whatever kids can do to help their powers of observation is a really, really wonderful thing for parents to encourage. So I took my tree climbing seriously after having my little share of tree houses and little crazy forts out in the backyard as a kid. I did grow up and become one of the world's first arbornauts. Astronauts, of course, explore outer space, and aquanauts explore under the sea, but arbornauts, based on that word arbor, meaning tree, are people who explore the treetops. And so I ended up getting a scholarship to Sydney University in Australia, scared to death, got to this continent where the trees were super tall compared to my very rural town in upstate New York. And lo and behold, I thought, how could I ever study the tree if I can't see it? And so I sewed harness with a sewing machine, industrial sewing machine. I welded a slingshot at the university shop, and I borrowed some ropes from the caving club, and lo and behold, kind of figured out how to climb some of these very tall Australian rainforest trees. It was really scary at first. I thought for sure I would fall, or maybe the ants would bite me or something would happen, but it was extraordinary when I got to the top. Of course, all the life is at the top of the tree. Some 50% of species on Earth we now know live in the tops of trees. And so everything is up there to pollinate, to eat leaves, to eat flowers, to reproduce, to eat each other, to do all kinds of things. So the canopy is the real hotspot for activity. And so over time, that became my second home. And I was able to see and discover and learn about so many different things that are nothing similar to the forest floor. In fact, the forest floor of a rainforest has about 1% of the light of the treetops. So you can imagine the growth and the life and the excitement in the canopy is obviously about 99 times more than it is on the forest floor. So here are a number of pictures just illustrating all of those climbs and trees, and you can even see a couple different methods over time. I developed canopy walkways. I used hot air balloons, which were designed by some French colleagues. I obviously climbed at day and at night, and even taught students to climb with me. So lots of tree adventures that are shared in my book called The Arbornaut. So this was the biggest discovery. It's so incredible to realize that even as late as the 1980s, when I first started climbing trees, that we didn't know where most of the species on Earth lived. And from work by a handful of us, arbornauts, we found out that about half of the creatures on the land part of our planet live in the tops of trees. Unfortunately, only about 10% of them have ever been seen or classified or discovered. So that means we have a whole lot of work ahead of us to try to recruit more scientists, to get more equipment to study what lives in the treetops, because we know things have the cure for cancer up there. We know there are many, not just medicines, but foods and equipment for building and construction and all sorts of really, really important creatures that do wonderful things to keep our planet healthy. So we really, really need to focus on studying in the treetops. I wished one of you could introduce me to Jeff Bezos, because, having the company called Amazon, wouldn't you think he'd want to come and do the canopies of the Amazon and help me discover all those new species? So I'm still waiting for my introduction. Maybe it can come through Ohio. So in the book, there's a whole sequence of my life. It's kind of positioned like a memoir, just because I wanted people to walk through this trajectory of a girl in science. There was no strategic plan in my life and no strategic mentor that told me what to do next, but really by chance, I ended up becoming one of the world's first arbornauts. So hopefully the chapters in the book share that story. And, after being a shy kid that did wildflower collections, I did, of course, climb these trees in Australia in 1979. And then I went on to build the first public canopy walkway in Australia about 5 years later, in part because I was working at an ecotourist lodge, and they were really nervous about the fact that I was teaching people to climb and getting volunteers to help me with my research on a rope. And the owners of the lodge said, maybe it would be safer if we did it a different way. And so we designed this first canopy walkway in Queensland, which now is a technology that we're using around the world, and hopefully using it to save forests. Because if we can develop the industry of ecotourism so local people get sustainable income, we can certainly prevent them from being tempted to log the forests. We also, in my field, have a couple other items in our toolkit. The Smithsonian pioneered the use of a construction crane in 1992. There are about 10 of these around the world to study forest canopies. and yet they're a little more expensive than most countries can afford. They cost about $1 million to establish and hire a driver to operate it. So many countries don't have that type of budget for conservation, unfortunately. And so this method is a little bit limited. We also had, in my case, I was in Australia for my formative years of education and getting married and having my children over there. And then I came back to teach at Williams College in 1992, and lo and behold, built the first canopy walkway in North America on the campus of Williams College in Massachusetts, and went on to participate in expeditions with French and other scientists around the world using these fabulous inflatable devices in many different countries. But again, a little like the construction crane, it costs probably $1 million to launch an expedition for 50 scientists in an inflatable balloon and raft, as is pictured here. So not too many places can afford that type of budget for trees. It's a little sad to admit that, because you all know the budget for NASA is billions of dollars, and the budget for health is billions and billions and billions of dollars, as it should be. But I think the budget for trees and field biology is very small. And so we have to struggle to keep our planet healthy, because trees are really one of the main organisms that keeps us alive. At the same time, I moved eventually down to Florida, where I built the first public canopy walkway here in Myakka River State Park, which is just outside of Sarasota. This walkway gets about 500,000 visitors a year. It generates about $30 million in tourism industry, and it has become an iconic construction, in the sense that we're now trying to use this model to think about building these walkways in countries that could really use the income, and especially where people could really use the economy for jobs. So that's a story I'll talk about in a minute. I founded a foundation, a nonprofit, a 501c3, so we could fundraise for these walkways. And lo and behold, wrote this book just last year that tells the story of trees through my voice as a treetop biologist, or an arbornaut, and explains why I call it the 8th continent, because really it's so full of new and innovative discovery that it's very much probably like Christopher Columbus felt when he was visiting the New World and finding new continents indeed. So with all that, I do want to say one really important take-home message that I hope is very strong in the book and in every country I work in, but especially in America. It's sometimes hard for people to know how important trees are to keep human beings alive. And I always tell my students, memorize this list and share it at cocktail parties, and tell your friends in sports and religion and teachers all of these important things that trees do for you, so that people start to understand they are truly essential for our life on Earth. And trees, of course, give us fresh water. They cleanse toxic water through their canopies. They provide oxygen through photosynthesis and all of those millions of leaves. They give us timber and food and clothing. One of my favorite foods comes from a tree, which is chocolate. A few others, of course, oranges and cherries and mangoes. You can just imagine a huge list probably in your refrigerator or your kitchen of things that come from trees, which is so important. Trees provide clothing for so many people through weaving of the fibers, use of some of the different roots or some of the bark. It's an amazing material that can be transformed into different products. Trees keep our soil safe. If you don't have tree roots, a lot of times when it rains, the water floods and the soils all flow right out into the ocean because nothing holds them securely. Trees, we now know, are home to half of Earth's species, which is huge. That means millions and millions of species. Trees store carbon, and we figured that out by climbing up these great big trunks and measuring them and realizing that these enormous pieces of wood are huge in storing the carbon that we actually pollute into the air through our carbon dioxide pollution from cars and transportation and other things. Trees are an amazing climate control. The weather is controlled by the Amazon and by large forests who actually really and truly have control over our rainfall, our winds, all sorts of things. If you look into weather or meteorology, you find out that forests are extraordinary in climate control, even the simpler things like cooling us through the shade that trees give our urban areas. And finally, you know, trees for 2 billion people provide a very important spiritual sanctuary. In Africa and India and many parts of Asia, trees not only are sacred in the villages, but a lot of churches are surrounded by trees. And we call those church forests because the priests feel that they are responsible for all of God's creatures. So it's a really, really significant part of life for many, many cultures. So again, in the book, I tried to emphasize how important it is to get kids outdoors. I talk a lot in my chapters about taking my own kids to the Amazon, to Belize, to Nepal, to all sorts of countries. I was a single mom, so I actually had to take my kids to work with me more often than not. They couldn't stay home alone and I would get arrested, I'm sure. But at the end of the day, I think I really try hard to mentor kids now and help girls as well as boys get outdoors. In my hometown of Elmira, New York, there's a Meg Lowman Treetops Camp. She's wearing the little logo t-shirt, and it's a pretty economically underserved town. So providing some of these girls with tree climbing lessons and some biology is very empowering for them. And who knows, maybe it will catapult them into the world of science or economics or something important that will help trees. Here's some third graders down here in Florida on the Canopy walkway that I built here in the state park. And these kids made little drawings of what they saw. And guess what? Through their drawings, we were able to discover a whole new species of insect. And at age 11, they got published in the scientific literature for this new discovery. So I always remind kids that there is so much to discover in the trees right in your own backyard. So maybe up there in Ohio, you can find some new species. The book moves from my life and inventing all of these tools for science and all of my trials and tribulations to measure leaves and what in the heck was going on in the top of the tree, to some case studies of different countries where the forests are really endangered and how I've used canopy biology or treetop access to help save the forests. So one of my favorites is the country of Ethiopia, which unfortunately has less than 3% of its forest left. And you can see in this picture here, the forest, which we call a church forest, is surrounding this little round building, which is the church, the Coptic or Ethiopian Amharic church. And the important thing, as I mentioned, with these spiritual trees is that the priests do believe they are the stewards of the human spirit as well as all of God's creatures. So the only really native trees in all of this subsistence agricultural landscape are those in this church forest. Yet the cattle get in and eat the seedlings. Sometimes the kids come and take logs and trees for mom's cook stove. People come in here and harvest trees selectively because they want wood for their houses and other products. So unfortunately, over time, all of these church forests are shrinking or degrading in many ways. So just recently, I started a project where we build these stone walls. You can barely see it here, but surrounding this church is a beautiful wall with all the stones hauled from the fields. And so the farmer's really happy about that, to get rid of the stones. And the people are thrilled because it means their forest is safe. And the priest is really thrilled because his mission is ensured, and best of all, for the children of the next generation in Ethiopia and for the children of the whole world, all of the birds and all of the insects and all of the animals in Ethiopia live in these little dots of green, and now we're helping preserve them. You can go on my website, www.treefoundation.org, and read about our program. We've been raising $1 million for the last 10 years to save the 40 most important forests in Ethiopia, and we're halfway there. Most of our donations have come from school kids sending in lunch money, and $75 or $100 at a time, because they really, really care about the kids in Ethiopia and want to share the amazing wealth that we have here in America compared to in Ethiopia. So we're halfway through in a mission to save these forests. We're really excited because basically these are libraries. These are the genetic library for the future of the whole country. And by saving these little spots, we can later worry about planting. Once the agricultural practices have advanced, we can go forward. But for now, all the pollinators, all the decomposers, all the native birds roost in these forests. So we need to save them today and not tomorrow. And you'll see that story is one of the chapters in the book. Here I am with the chief priest in Ethiopia forging our partnership. He wants to save all of God's creatures, and I, as a scientist, want to conserve biodiversity. So we actually have the same mission, which is great. And he has promised me a little room in the edge of one of the church forests. They're building it for me now, and we have a really great relationship of trust to complete this project. The solution, of course, is building the walls, which you see here, and educating the priests, which you see here, through workshops and teaching them about the importance of trees, because they don't have computers or cell phones or aerial maps. So they don't know that 97% of their forests are cut down. And that's my job as a person who comes from a world where we have technology. I can share my knowledge and help them achieve better solutions that way. And this is one of our first walls. You can see the beautiful lush green behind the wall, and you can see how dry and arid it is outside of the wall, but hopefully we will be able to really help Ethiopians to preserve all of God's creatures or their biodiversity, whatever you want to call it. So that means that we have a big challenge. Ethiopia is not the only country that's lost so much of their forest. In fact, during my own lifetime, 50% of the world's forests have been cut down. That's a huge amount. And this is despite the fact that scientists collect data and lots of NGOs solicit money for conservation. Somehow we're just not doing it right. And I have thought long and hard about this during my 40 years as an arbornaut, and realized that maybe we have to do things a little differently. And one is to get the trust of the local people, not just throw money at big governments. And the other is to think of ways to help the local people realize the importance of their trees. So I have just started a new program called Mission Green. It's the last chapter in the book, in order to end the book on a hope spot, not a depressing chapter, and try to explain how canopies might be able to turn around our very depressing statistics about forest degradation. And the plan here is to base it on a program that a friend of mine started. Her name is Sylvia Earle, and she started a program called Mission Blue 10 years ago, where she brings attention to the most important spots under the ocean, which she calls hope spots. And she now has about 100 of those, with local communities helping preserve the reefs or the fisheries or the mangroves, whatever it happens to be. So with Mission Green, I partnered with one of the most famous biologists in the world named Ed Wilson at Harvard. Sadly, he passed away a few months ago, but not until he had really helped me map out this program called Mission Green, where we decided it would be really great to save the 10 most critically endangered genetic libraries in the world through this project. So we got a world-class set of experts as our board of directors, and we created our 10 sites based on the research of a lot of scientists. And right now I'm working really hard to create canopy walkways in 10 places. The first one will be Madagascar. I'm leaving in 2 weeks' time to go to Madagascar. Again, they have less than 3% of their forests left, but all of these darling lemurs are found nowhere else in the world except in Madagascar. And by building this walkway, we hope to fund the walkway through donations from American donors, and then turn it over to the local people, train the families and the women to be the ecotourist guides so that they can earn income by being the leaders and the organizers of the walkway. And if we're really lucky and raise enough money for each of these 10 sites, we could fund some students to do research there and discover all the new species. So we're really excited about this. We're heading to Madagascar. We're halfway funded for $1 million to build a walkway in Madagascar. And we're taking the engineers to design it and coming home and hopefully raising that other half so that we can save and help the amazing species of Madagascar, and also provide visitors like ourselves with this fabulous experience of going on a canopy walkway in Madagascar. So in the end, this is a little quote in our prospectus about Mission Green. It's kind of like triage in a hospital emergency room. We have to focus on saving the areas that make the biggest global difference. So we're starting with the 10 most critical forests to reverse species extinction and take giant steps toward a truly sustainable planet. So with that, read the book. You can hear about conservation ideas, and now you can go ahead and ask me some questions about anything to do with trees, or growing up as an arbornaut, or helping girls in science, or anything else that might be useful or maybe not useful. So thanks very much. Back to you, Troy.
Thank you very much. I love those photos too. They're fantastic. And I have to say, when I was reading the book and you were describing being on the airship floating over, I in my brain, it was blowing up because I was like, what could this possibly look like? So I had to go to the photo section to see that, and it just looks crazy. I mean, this blimp over the jungle, and you guys all
it's my absolute favorite thing. I always feel that I'm like Dorothy in the Wizard of Oz or something. It's amazing and fabulous. And to be honest, it's about the only way you can get to the very uppermost leaves, because the canopy walkway can't be supported that high and the ropes can't be supported that high. So it is a fabulous device.
Well, I'm going to introduce, I have a couple housekeeping things. I'm going to introduce my partner tonight, my Arbor Day book partner for life, I think, the mayor, Ben Kessler. He is here with me. How are you doing tonight, Mr. Mayor?
I'm having a ton of fun, Troy. Thank you. This is, it's been a year since we've done this, so it's great to be back. Talking
by popular demand is what I hear.
That's right. Yeah.
And I want to remind people out there that are watching to please submit questions in the chat. Ben and I will be asking some questions, but we would love to have your questions too, to ask Dr. Lowman. Would you like to start with the first question, Ben?
I would be very happy to do that. So this is going to be somewhat a selfish question, Dr. Meg, so I'm going to admit that in advance, but you talk a lot about your motto being no child left indoors, and your book covers really some remarkable stories about your life as a young child with your father and your mother, and how they supported you, and then how you supported your children. So being a father of at times recalcitrant children myself, I don't know if you have any pro tips on how to nudge our kids most effectively, I guess, into the outdoors.
That's a great question, and it is fun, and there's a lot of psychology in it. I used to say to my kids, do you want to go to visit this park or that park? Not do you want to stay home or go to the park? You just have to make sure you do the psychology of what the choices are and make sure they have outdoor options. But it is tricky, and we are in a world where seeing things on a computer screen is more comfortable, and maybe playing games or going to Disney World is more popular. So somehow parents do have to play the role of a dictator and make nature fun. So I hope you can do that and have picnics and birthday parties. I remember having one of my son's early birthday parties where I got one of my students to drop candy from the canopy, the treetops down, and all the kids love that, you know. So who knows what you can come up with, but I'm sure you have a lot of amazing trees and nature in your area. I will say canopy walkways to me are that sexy element that we're using in a sense to compete with Disney World to get kids to do something different. So they want to go out there rather than having to drag them out there is important. And there are, you know, different kinds of activities that hopefully can do that. Even going out at night with headlamps is really exciting and fun. And I think you want to work with your kids to get them to really look forward to those kind of adventures if you possibly can. Good luck, Dad.
Oh, thank you. I took some notes. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I want to follow that up a little bit because, you know, I think a recurring theme in the book is that childlike joy of science. And you start off by describing your own childhood and just this joyous curiosity about nature and the really intriguing. I'm not going to tell the story of the eggs that you have, but it's fascinating that as a child you concocted that experiment for your science. But you continually come back to children to educate, and not just educate, but to draw them into your projects and to involve them. And you even dragged your kids across the world, all over the place, right, to be your partners on this. Can you tell us a little bit about your own children, how they were up there in the trees and what they were doing?
Well, and of course, admittedly, as I said, I was a single mom, so I kind of had to take them with me. But I also had to make it fun because I didn't want them to ruin the entire experience. And they do have a bigger sense of wonder. When you do experience nature through kids, I think it's inspirational for all of us adults to see the natural world through their eyes. They see the bugs first. They see the colors, they find things, they get excited about things. So in some ways, my boys really did keep my own sense of wonder ignited better than maybe it would have otherwise been. So that was fantastic. And, you know, we had some funny experiences going to Belize and staying in a remote cabin in the jungle and having tarantulas all over the ceiling and, you know, having to convince them that this was a wonderful place to sleep, even though I was more scared than they were. Just, you know, but then again, that's just part of nature. And to be honest, I don't think the tarantulas wanted much to do with us. They were much happier to hunt the mosquitoes. So that was a good thing. There's always something to learn from nature. And I think for me personally, I find that kids do inspire me to think about a sense of wonder. So I try to engage them, and B, a lot of us are parents, not all of us, but I think it's a really critical time. As the mayor mentioned, you know, you have a window of opportunity with your kids. And so I try to push that in the book for parents and kids to think harder. Everybody lights up when I say, have you ever climbed a tree? There's something nice about that. They probably don't say that if I said, have you ever mapped your DNA? They're probably like, what? What are you talking about? But from this very simple thing of climbing a tree, it does, I think, give people a sense to say, you know what, I've been a naturalist, I've been a biologist, but I never knew it. So if I can kind of build on that simple experience, it really, I think, would make my science richer and hopefully make the world a better place.
So, Dr. Meg, one of the things that I think is really neat about your story is how you sort of just kept on kind of exploring and pushing the envelope a little further and exploring a little further afield. I love, there's almost like a James Bond gadget aspects to this, where you're like, I just need to get higher and higher in the tree. And so I have a million questions about how you did that, and I'll try to keep on task here. But I just had to ask myself, like, do you have a fear of heights? Like, do you have any scary close calls? What's the highest you've ever been in a tree?
Yeah, that's great. You know, I did have a fear of heights. I was scared out of my wits the first time I climbed a coachwood tree in Australia, simply because I wasn't confident about picking the right branch to put the rope over. And once I got a better sense of what trees had hardwood versus softwood and how to look for termites or other kinds of damage, I felt a little better. But there's always that level of anxiety. But I like to say to people, I had a big respect for heights, maybe not an all and out fear. And I have climbed up to 300 feet. The tallest trees in the world, redwoods, the great kapok trees in the Amazon, and the dipterocarps in Malaysia are over 300 feet tall, and that's enormous. It's incredible to think about. Thankfully, most of my students do all that climbing now. As I age out of it, I have to pass the baton, which is really great. But I do also tell students that I spent at least half of my career designing my toolkit. It would be like wanting to go into outer space before rockets were developed. You know, someone came along early on and said, holy cow, how do we do this? And what's surprising to me is that we missed 95% of the tree for centuries. Foresters only looked at the bottom of a tree and mostly cut them down. And we really missed so much of the action by not realizing or studying or accessing the whole tree until a couple decades ago with designing some of these methods. So it is a real, you know, it is a toolkit story as much as anything.
Yeah.
And I think we all have, at least when we start to learn or think about trees, we do think like, wow, it's just sort of peaceful and quiet up there. And you're telling us that it's not, right? And there's a quote here that says, half of all terrestrial creatures live 100 feet above our heads. And you compare them to coral reefs a little bit with all the life and activity that's up there. So can you tell us a little bit about what's up there and what are the interactions with with some of those organisms in the trees?
Yeah, and this is amazing. Again, I call it hit you over the head science, meaning it's not something that I had to be some like brilliant Einstein to figure out. But basically, when you think about it, the sun hits the tops of the trees. It never hits the bottom. So that's where all the leaves are growing. That's where all the flowers exist. And because all the leaves and the flowers are so vibrant and lively and fast growing at the top, that's where all the animals are. The pollinators are up there. And so are the birds and lizards that eat the pollinators. And so are the beetles that eat the leaves. And so are the critters that eat the beetles. So not surprisingly, it's this giant hotspot for biodiversity because the sun, and of course the rain hits there first as well. All of the elements for life are at the top of the tree. So therefore, most of the life is in the same place. And it is amazing to realize that we overlooked that. And I think of those early foresters cutting trees down, and probably they saw nothing at the top of the tree. When the tree had collapsed onto the forest floor, they'd either squished all the birds or, you know, the insects had flown away. So they never probably witness to the biodiversity that was there. You just have to go up on something like a rope or a walkway to experience the biodiversity as it is in a living, healthy tree. It certainly wouldn't survive on the ground that way.
Yeah. So to pick up on biodiversity and sort of seeing the world through a different lens, this question is coming from the chat, but are there any areas within North America or inside the US that you think are really critical today that need protecting especially?
Absolutely. And I'm really happy to announce we just have a walkway out in the redwood trees. Redwoods are very iconic, one of the world's tallest trees. More people have gone to the moon that have climbed a redwood, if you can believe it. So we have this, and probably very few people have ever even seen a redwood as tourists. So we have this iconic, globally renowned, amazing tree with next to no knowledge about it. So that's fantastic in itself. And so that was one of our 10 forest sites for Mission Green, that we need a canopy walkway in the redwoods. And at the Sequoia Zoo in Eureka, California, they just opened the walkway last August, which is fabulous. It's in a young forest, meaning the trees are only 100 feet tall, which I find very amusing because that's pretty tall for a lot of us from the East Coast. But at least it's a great opportunity for kids and families to start learning about North America's most iconic tree. The second place that we're very excited about, probably developing a walkway in the near future. It's not one of the top 10, but it would be definitely one of the top 20 critical forests, are the Great Smoky Mountains. Those forests that run through that eastern corridor have the highest biodiversity as much as is known. Now, we don't know a whole lot about biodiversity in forests, but for what we do know, those Great Smoky Mountain moist gullies of primary trees, there's not too many left along those corridors, but they are very, very special. And so we're kind of hoping to get some traction in the next few years, perhaps with North Carolina or any number of sites where we could feature a walkway in that location. So those would be two places to start with. Now, in Ohio, I have to say to you, you have the Morton Arboretum. I don't know how far away that is, but they did build a great canopy walkway 2 years ago in your beautiful oaks and maples. And it's a fabulous ecotourism experience if you ever get up near Cleveland.
We have fantastic giant oaks all throughout the city of Bexley.
Ooh, and you need your own walkway. Forget about going up to the Morton Arboretum.
We might be able to work on that. Maybe we'll think about that. One of the themes too that I think as you read the book is, you mentioned that you didn't have any peers, you didn't have any mentors. Being a woman in science, the way that you describe that struggle is sobering. There's some horrifying stories in there, and it's also somewhat inspirational, of course, to see you succeed, and not only see you succeed, but really unfurl that banner and kind of pave, clear. I don't want to use a clearing analogy here, but I imagine when you wrote the book that you really had to think about reflecting back on those experiences and see how you felt about those. So I'm just curious how you look back on that now, and what you think the state of women in science in the United States and the world is right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, I certainly look back on all that with great sadness. And I have to say, I've written about 8 other books, but it wasn't until this age that I dared put some of that on paper. I was very scared to write about negative experiences for fear of losing my job or being considered some kind of, sort of critical person. You as a woman, I think you probably overreact, that we worry so much about being considered a little too extreme if we were ever to write anything negative about a male boss or something like that. But I thought to myself too, if I go to the grave with all of these experiences that other peers had similarly experienced, then I probably wouldn't have really been that helpful to the next generation of women. So I did put the pen to paper, and Farrar, Straus and Giroux, have their legal team. They looked at it and said, made sure that I wasn't doing anything untoward. But I think it's getting better. And I think perhaps because people like me are willing to speak up, that it's becoming helpful for women. I think we see a lot more women getting degrees in science, which is great. What I'm still fearful of is that we don't have as many women in the leadership roles to be the role models. It's getting better, but it's slower. And until that generation now achieves those leadership roles, there may be fewer women that are the role models for the next generation. And let's face it, this is a tricky thing, but in science, you're rewarded by getting tenure or publishing a lot of papers. And the years when women have babies is in their 30s, just when the career should be taking off. And so that makes for a very difficult conflict in my field, and probably in other fields where women are trying to build up their business resume or their law cases or whatever it might be. And, until the day comes when men can have babies, there might not be equality in entirety, but I think we have to figure out ways to allow women to work part-time or catch up or do something if they do end up having children at a critical point in their career, which is a really tough, I think, conflict of interest to have.
To sort of riff on that a little bit, what would you recommend to the fathers or the mothers, the grandmothers, the grandfathers out there raising young women and helping them to have the boldness to succeed.
Yeah, obviously I would have wished to have a partner that would do 50% of the childcare, but it's hard to come by. There are those physiological connections between, biologically speaking, the woman has the baby and the baby resonates to the mom. So there are a lot of reasons. I think one of the ideal models I've seen, my college roommate was a doctor, and the medical profession allowed her to work part-time, paid her enough to have a nanny. So she had a great life because she could pay attention to her kids, work part-time, and then re-enter the workforce with great dignity in 5 or 10 years' time without penalty. And that seemed fabulous. I'm not sure that really exists in academia, and I don't know if it exists in a lot of other fields, but the sooner we could have those levels of part-time work with the opportunity to return. I think it's great to be home with your kids, and there's something special about doing that. I would hate for women to have to compete on an equal footing with men to be working 50 hours a week or doing whatever it is to publish all the data they needed to publish. So somehow we have to respect that role of being a mom and try to figure out how to integrate that into society so we can use women's intellect. In my world of conservation, I need to say there's very few women at the decision-making tables, and yet we aren't succeeding with conservation. And a lot of us wonder, what if women were, heading up Brazil and heading up countries and heading up the UN and places where we could help to broker these decisions? Would we arrive at some better conclusions? We like to hope we would, but I think, the day needs to come when there's a little more diversity at some of these decision-making tables, and somehow we have to help women and minorities become part of that leadership team.
One thing I think that you have also really, there's part of a reason for your success is that you've really taken this and brought it into a living experience in those walkways and taking people up into the trees. And, I can just only imagine that is a very exhilarating experience and probably life-changing to some extent. Do you have dreams about trees? Do you dream about being up in the trees?
I guess I probably do. Live it, breathe it, dream it. Anyway, I suppose I really do. Yeah, I have a lot of great dreams, but the one thing that's hard to stop thinking about is the depressing element of losing all these trees. So I just hope that things like canopy walkways and towns like yours, where you tell me you have great big oak trees, will start to predominate, and people will be willing to pay money to have a big tree on their property rather than say, oh, we'd like to cut it down to build a bigger garage or something like that. So we do need to turn around the mentality, I think, of how people view these big trees. They're the most senior citizens in the community, and they house all the biodiversity, and they do all of these services. And yet somehow, I think, especially in America, we think we can cut them down and just plant a seedling and that's equal. And it's certainly not equal at all.
So a little bit to follow up with that, dreaming of trees and walkways. So Bexley, just to give you a little background, we're about 2.5 square mile city. We have over 14,000 street trees that we manage. And we have forest along a waterway that goes along the city. We have about a 30-acre forest within our major park in the city that we protect zealously and carefully. So in a context like that, and this is kind of an unfair question I'm going to spring on you, but I just got to ask, what does a canopy walkway in Bexley look like?
Gosh, I think it would be stunning. It probably would look similar to the one I built here in Florida, and maybe similar to the one that exists in Quechee, Vermont, which we just finished. But for 100 or 200 feet of bridge with a tower on either end, you could have an extraordinary experience, I'm sure. And believe it or not, there are still things to discover in our temperate trees. It's not all about having all research exclusively in the tropics. Even though we don't know a lot about tropical rainforests, we really don't know much about temperate treetops either. So you could have a field day. It could be great.
Okay, I love it.
There's a lot of buzz lately about trees and the communication between trees and mycorrhizae and those root. We also, I think, are spending a lot more time now reassessing what we think of as living and what we think of as consciousness. And so I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on trees in terms of consciousness or communication or anything like that.
Yeah, the first tree communication was a professor at Penn State in the 1980s, a guy named Jack Schultz, who found that tree leaves actually communicated because when they got eaten, they sent off chemicals in the air that warned the other trees, make the chemicals, keep the bugs from eating you. It was extraordinary work that he did in New Hampshire. And so we know that the canopies have been communicating as well as the underground. And I actually did a lot of work on mycorrhizae in Australia as well as in the canopy, just because we thought that maybe the roots were one of the reasons why there was more or less diversity of species. Maybe the mycorrhizae imparted an advantage on certain species over others, if that makes sense. The communication part is simply the biological sense of having all these chemicals and having these abilities to share water and share nutrients and do things. I guess it's kind of, maybe in the world of science, it's just that everything is trying to survive. I guess I would use communication and survival equally. It is different from my saying to you, oh, like, I like your glasses, they're really great. That's a communication. But I think with trees, like a lot of biodiversity, there's this sense of wanting the progeny to succeed and wanting to figure out ways to ensure that. And so that is, in a sense, communication, and it's really exciting. And I think it's a little bit, how do we express it as humans? We've always known that trees communicated. It's nothing new, but now we're just saying it in a way that maybe is a little more sexy or fun. But I think we always realized that trees had this incredible advantage of either helping their seedlings or providing sustenance for their neighbors, or maybe helping the entire climate. I mean, the fig tree that I talk about in my chapter on women in science is obviously this tree that supports millions of species in its canopy. So trees might not only be helpful to their own kind, but even to the whole community in a sense, which is a huge type of communication too.
And quick question, because what was asked in the chat, you spoke about the fig tree, and I kind of got a sense that if you had a favorite, maybe the fig tree was your favorite. Do you play favorites? Do you have a superlative?
Well, I have to, because every time I give a talk to fifth grades, which I do a lot, they always say, what's your favorite tree? And I do love fig trees simply because they are this big mother tree that keeps so much life going in everywhere, from sacred figs in the villages of India to figs down in the Amazon where all the birds cluster to feed on them, to humans who eat, some 300 varieties of figs, and we consider them quite elegant and wonderful. They're not cheap in my grocery store. And then of course those stranglers, which are a type of fig, are these banyan trees, which are called strangler figs, which I use as the analogy that maybe more women need to become more strategic in how we, use our resources. And I had a little bit of fun with that.
Yeah. So, Troy, this is a piggyback. I'm piggybacking Troy. Sorry, I have one follow up to that. So,
allowed.
Speaking of favorite trees, one of our residents here on the thread is talking about one of his most recent favorite, the beech, which is a gorgeous. I was just enjoying looking at beech groves through a hike yesterday. Is currently being threatened by invasive species and disease. We've dealt with the ash tree here in Ohio, elm. And last year's Arbor Month book selection spoke about the chestnut tree, the great chestnut tree, and its demise. So this is a largely ignored issue. Do you have any insight into how we can be more proactive and more productive in fighting invasive species and disease?
Yeah, it's a really tough call because humans, of course, have introduced a lot of these insects in particular that are attacking all of our native trees. And there's probably an insect for every native tree right now, which is very, very discouraging. One of the best protections is having diverse forests. Is, you know, the plantations really encourage insects to have outbreaks, because one insect that, say, eats a certain kind of tree, like the pine, if it discovers a beautiful plantation of pine, then that insect will build up into the millions and millions of individuals. So the more diverse the forests are, the harder it is for the predators to find the chestnut tree, or in your case, you know, whatever species it is you're trying to protect. Unfortunately, we're going to be at a point where we have to reconfigure what kinds of trees we plant. Will it be successful to breed chestnuts with, I think it's the Chinese chestnut and the American chestnut, they're trying to configure a variety that will survive. And I remember elms when I was a college student. The ones that survived, the American elms, were the isolated individual species in little towns in Massachusetts where there were no other elms around. And it was always so special to see them, but eventually they too went the route. It's almost impossible to pay enough money to, you know, protect a tree from insects. Insects are so successful. That's their lifestyle. And so I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but we just have to, you know, prevent the transportation of insects, which I guess we won't be able to do because humans keep moving around and taking suitcases and, you know, bringing things in on their shoes, or figure out a way to kind of hide our trees in diverse stands of forests where they wouldn't be as obvious to the insect pests.
I'm going to stay on this thread a little bit because I want to say what a great choice, by the way, writing choice it is to have those chapters interspersed with little sections on the different trees that you're talking about, because it's so fascinating to read about, you know, the life cycles of some of these trees and just how interesting and unique. And, you know, the fig tree, for instance, you're talking about grows from the top down, right? I mean, that's amazing.
Oh, cool. It is so cool.
How fantastic that is. But you saved the best for last for me, because I hung in there, and the very last one you did was the giant redwoods, right? Yeah. And you and those are my favorites. Those are so fantastic.
Oh, great.
You call them living fossils. And I just want you to speak for a few minutes and tell us that these are really special organisms, aren't they?
Oh my gosh, they are. And, you know, their canopies are, you can get lost in them, literally. It's just extraordinary to think about that. And they are so old and so vulnerable. I was a resident of California for 5 years when I was the director of science at the California Academy, and did a lot of programs out at the Muir Woods, and worked a little bit with the Yurok Indians in Northern California to think about maybe building a walkway in their forest. So we had all kinds of activities going on. I wrote a chapter in the 100th anniversary book for Save the Redwoods League. So I was totally a junkie for redwoods. Whatever I could do for them, I would try to do, but they're still a mystery. You know, I just did an interview the other day with some journalists out there. They said, what are the important species in the redwoods? I said, I don't know. Nobody really knows. There's, you know, a few iconic things like the, you know, an owl here, a marbled murrelet, or, you know, a few things that have been in the news, but we really, really don't know a lot about what's up in these amazing giant communities and what might have been up there 4,000 years ago when they were little itty bitty trees. So that's for the future arbornauts. You could have a field station up there and live up there, and that might be the best thing to do.
So speaking of being up there and living up there, kind of have a two-part question. First off, like Troy, I'm fascinated by the balloon rafts. So I need to know a little bit more here. Like, so the balloon rafts, they come up, and do they rest on the top of the canopy? And do you stay on there for a while? Like, how long are you up in the balloon rafts?
Right. So there's 3 inflatable pieces to the whole gear. One is the actual balloon or dirigible that flies up and can seat about 6 in its little bucket. So maybe you want to take some samples of the air. Maybe you want to take some aerial photos or something like that. And then there's a raft, which is a bicycle-shaped wheel contraption. The balloon moves the raft about every 3 days to a new tree because we want to tether it and study the different trees, but not for too long. It's not destructive because it's so light, but we don't still want to keep it there for too long. And then there's this cute little gadget we call the sled, or the luge in French, which is a piece of the bicycle tire. It's a pie-shaped piece, triangular, that the actual balloon can tow. So they can tow us through the air from tree to tree. Say we can do 10 trees in 3 hours. If, for example, I want to sample the insects eating the leaves, I can take my nets and trays and, you know, suction cups, and they alight on a tree, and I get busy on the edge of the sled and sample some things, and then we move on to the next tree. Or sometimes people want to collect the flowers or samples of vines or whatever happens to be important to the different scientists. So it's the hot air balloon, the actual raft, and then the little mobile sled that comprise the 3 inflatable gadgets, and all designed by the French. I give a lot of credit to the Institute of Botany in Montpellier, France. A guy named Francis Halley is a very now venerable and old and retired botanist that creatively designed these things way back when, but he's hardly had any funding for that. He's had about 4 or 5 expeditions. It costs about $1 million to take 50 scientists using those gadgets for 2 weeks. And yet there's no sources of funding. There's not a NASA. There's not a Woods Hole that there is for undersea. There's not really a rainforest field center that would fund that type of research. So it hasn't been utilized nearly as much as it should.
So would you spend 3 weeks in the canopy, or would you come down and what is the longest that you've ever spent continuously up in the canopy?
Right. So I would spend the night up there, and then I would come down and analyze my samples and do my ablutions, admittedly, and usually eat. So that was one important thing. There are no actual accommodations in the canopy. When we were up there, we would sleep out on the raft and invariably get rained upon and eaten by mosquitoes because there wasn't any real protective way to, but it was fun. And it was always fun to do that because kids would ask about it, and because I wanted to sample at night, which became very important to a lot of my work. But there isn't to this day a field station in the canopy. There's talk about it. There has been talk for 20 years. My famous colleague, Edward O. Wilson from Harvard, who's now deceased, always thought it would be great. He called it biotopia to create a canopy field station. And it's disappointing to think that nobody's taken that idea and run with it, because how cool would that be?
Absolutely.
I salute the bravery and the faith of the first group of people who climbed aboard the inflatable for that initial journey. but it just looks awesome. I just really impressive about you opening doors and bringing in, students with, the Jason project and all of these things. And I'm just really amazed, even like to extend mobility limited students, people who are limited to wheelchairs. You've built these walkways with ramps so that they can go up, and also involved students and people with just active research too, not just bringing them up there to look around, but actually being part of your research. Can you talk about the motivation and also that experience as well?
I guess maybe that just is an extension of myself, because I was excluded in a way. I was excluded in geology class in college, and basically, in the minority for a lot of those early expeditions. So it gave me a little personal sense of how that felt, which isn't very good. It doesn't feel great to be the minority or to be excluded. So it did, I guess, put me on a pathway of more inclusivity, and I ended up with that role in a lot of my leadership jobs with different scientific societies or with different museums where I work, trying to be more inclusive in our staffing and how we solicited, students to come in and be part of it. I remember as the science director at the museum in Raleigh, North Carolina, we marveled that we lamented that we never had too many Latino families, and yet we had a lot of population. And finally, we got some interviews and some data, and it was because they said that's a white person's museum. We're not really welcome there. It's amazing how these barriers get built up, even if they're not correct. And so then we had to work on things like, let's have a red hot pepper festival, or let's have some, specific ads aimed at inclusivity and getting more involvement of everybody in the museum, not just the same kind. So I think wherever we turn around, we have to really analyze the history of the exclusion and then solve it with the inclusion. And that's been something that it meant a lot to me to try to do that.
Speaking of inclusion, it seems like a lot of the forests that you've worked in order to really effectively preserve them and research in them, you really would need support from local populations, from leadership in the area, I would think, regulatory support. What have been some successful strategies in obtaining that support, maybe in some difficult contexts?
Right, and I think that is important. It's one thing that is probably not taught well for graduate students or research students, and that is developing trust in places where you might think, oh, I just need to rush in there and collect my data and come home and get promoted for publishing it, and not think anything about what's really on the ground when you're in the local district. But what I've learned over many years is that it's all about the trust, and it's only about the trust. And you can't save the forests or collect good data or have the cooperation without trust. And Ethiopia is a great example where I pray a lot there. I don't normally go to church all the time in Florida, but when I'm in Ethiopia, I become part of the community, and for them, prayer is really important. And they pray for me and I pray for them, and we work together because we have trust. It's one of the few times where being a woman is actually advantageous. When I worked in Cameroon, Africa, they always put me in the front seat of the vehicle so that all the people would recognize, oh, there's a female, because I was a more trustworthy figure than all of the male scientists. And I had my little photo album of my children, and in the villages, they all loved to see those pictures. So there were just ways of trying to weave trust into the whole process of being successful as a scientist and having good communication with the local people. So I think it's always really, really critical to develop trust. And in a leadership context, that may or may not be what we're taught. We're taught make a lot of money or publish a lot of papers or take over or have a lot of power in some ways. But in the world of conservation, that's a pretty critical part of having success. And I hope more and more that it could be taught, even at a young age. How can young people develop trust with neighbors, trust with different people in their community? It's so critical.
Yeah.
Throw something that I feel strongly about in there as well, and that is having scientists in elected positions and in government too, because I think that's really an important part of enacting some of these important things, is having people in those positions that are advocates and understand a lot of what's going on.
Absolutely fantastic. Yes, and we probably need to encourage that more and more.
I want to ask, I know we're getting close to the end here. I want to ask you to tell everybody, if they don't know, about water bears and your work with water bears. Fascinating, the most fascinating organisms.
They are, and of course, they are microscopic. And I have to confess that a lot of my interest in water bears is that when I was a graduate student, the guy who had a desk near me was a water bear taxonomist, meaning he spent his whole day looking down a microscope. And identifying these microscopic things that nobody really ever saw. And they were so cute. They look like a bear and they float. And now we know they're very extreme. They're tolerant of cold, of heat. They've been to outer space and back. And the reason I actually got involved in the water bear world was when I proposed this project with the kids in wheelchairs to do research in the canopy. As you mentioned a bit earlier, they could have just gone up there and had a look and come down and said, wow, that's cool, and end of subject. Or we could get them involved in doing some real original research. And so to find something, oh, cool, thank you for doing that, that was possible to discover new species, water bears was a given. It's pretty hard to discover a new species of bird working in Kansas or Ohio or North Carolina. But guess what? It's easy to discover a new species of water bear because they're still so unknown. And we picked that phylum, believe it or not. Tardigrade, or tardigrada as it's called, is a whole phylum of organisms kind of related to nematodes and distantly related to insects. So we used this group for our students in wheelchairs, and they all did discover new species and get to publish their data, which of course made it seem a little more inspiring for them to consider a career in science, which was our goal. But water bears are certainly cool, and I'm excited about them to this day. My poor kids, I named a water bear after each of them for their wedding presents. So we have the Ellen Eddie and we have the Burgessii, but it's kind of like, what's a mom scientist going to do for her son? Probably not give him a down payment on a house or a car, but they get a species of water bear.
That's great. That's so fun. That's so much fun. Oh. And there's a lot of that stuff out there, right? There's so much that is undiscovered. There's so much exciting stuff, right?
And I hope if your readers, do read the book, they will find many places. I hope I alluded to so many spots where we haven't done enough research, where we need more observations, and not all of it requires high technology. It just requires curious people. So maybe you'll become a little epicenter up there in Ohio of treetop explorers.
I like it. I think Bexley's ready to lead the way there. I know we're looking to see if there are any last questions, and we're soliciting them out there. Did I hear a rumor that one of the things that you're looking to explore right now at this point in your life is learning to play golf?
Oh, you did. I had this dream all my life that when I retired, which I'm not sure what that means, I would write a book, which I did, and I would learn to play golf, because I also realized that that's where all the deals were made. Now, I have to say that I need to write another book, because I should have started at age 30 so I could have made the deals. But because of COVID, and I was here in Florida, it was the one sport that kept going. Like, you could play golf because it's outdoors and it's not contagious. So I did take lessons, and I am taking it up. And I'm intrigued about creating with golf courses, especially here in Florida, bird habitat and nature walks for kids. I feel like they have a bad rap, but they're these big green spaces. So could we make them, there is such a thing as the Audubon certification, but I'm working with my own local club to figure out ways. We just started a Mission Green Oaks Women's Club group that wants to do environmental things with our golf club. So I'll keep you posted if you have a golf club up there.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, watch out. Troy could talk about this one for quite a while. So
really? Okay.
Just to let you know, the golf club that I go to is called Hickory Hills. It's full of trees, so you would love it.
Great. Then I definitely need to come up.
I think Dr. Meg, one of the great takeaways I have from your book is your ability to find adventure in all these different various pockets of nature. And while you focus a lot, of course, on the canopy, you starting at a young age. You talk about how you spent so much time learning to identify these eggs that you had found, and going through that journey of discovery. You talk about taking your kids out into the forest and how they discovered a species of spider that had never been found before, just because of their ability to have open eyes and look around them. And when we walk even through our relatively boring North American forest habitats, staying still and looking around us and starting to really explore. It's amazing what we can find, even in that boring below the canopy area. So I think that for me is just a universal and really powerful message here. It's just not only the value of conservation and the importance of it, but the excitement of discovery and the ability to discover in all of these different contexts. And it's such a gift that you have.
Oh, well, thanks. I'm so glad that that resonates with the book. And that's why I'm hopeful people will read it and maybe empower themselves and their families to think similarly. So thanks so much.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay.
Thank you so
You can
much for
pick
joining us.
up the Arbornaut at your local library.
Yeah.
I
Yes.
recommend the Bexley Public Library.
Yes, so do we.
Great.
No.
Well, I'm so thrilled. Send me a few
So-
pictures of your trees.
Absolutely.
Wow.
I want to just thank everybody for coming this evening and joining us. And big thanks to Arbornaut Meg Lowman and City Council President Troy Markham, and our Mayor Ben Kessler for putting on such a great event tonight. And thanks once again to Paige and Michael Crane and the Arbor Day Celebrations Committee for making this evening possible for us. And please don't forget that we have Arbor Day celebrations going on the rest of the month. So please come out and join us. Check out www.bexley.org/Arbor Day. And join us for some more tremendous events.
Thanks again, everybody. Good night.
Thank you all.